The female brain actually has high densities of receptors for estrogen and progesterone in certain areas that are related to emotional processing, discernment, decision making, and emotional regulation, and things like that. So that is the prefrontal cortex, the hippocampus, the hypothalamus, the insula, and the anterior cingulate gyrus. These are some areas that are significantly affected and have significantly dense receptors for these two hormones. So this is a really interesting finding that only came about in the last 10 years that really got neuroscientists scratching their heads and saying, okay, if estrogen and progesterone are actually not only ovarian hormones, but they're important neurotransmitters, what does that mean?
Dr. Kayla Osterhoff, welcome to the Root Cause Medicine podcast. I am so excited to have you on today.
I am so excited to be here. Thank you so much for having me on.
Well, you are one of my favorite people when it comes to, you're younger than me. And when I grow up, I want to be you. Your bio, the things you do in research, the education you do around women's health, I'm like, I'm so glad we're friends because when I get older, I want to be Kayla.
Oh, thank you. I feel the same way about you. I'm like, she's the hormone whisperer and guru. So when I go through, especially perimenopause and menopause, like you're my go-to woman. I need to download your brain into my brain, and then we should just switch. We can swap. I'll let you download my brain. You give me your brain, and then we'll be super women.
I wish that was an option. That would be perfect. Perfect. I would love to download your brain, especially because today we're actually not so much talking about perimenopause and menopause, but I really want to talk to you about the women's menstrual cycle or rhythm, biorhythm, as you call it, because it's taken social media by storm for good reason. But what I'm finding, oddly, is that there are a lot of naysayers. So there are a lot of doctors, right? There are a lot of people who are like, that's not true. We don't have to take the women's menstrual cycle into account. In fact, we can just put them on the continuous pill. It's no big deal. But your entire background and research and what you know, I was like, I need to have her on and talk about this because there are phases to the menstrual cycle. You talk about superpowers with the menstrual cycle. You talk about us women being different people through the menstrual cycle. And that's what I want to get in today for everyone listening to understand this.
Yeah. It's huge. It's like this missing piece of information that we as a society critically need. And this missing piece of information is also the reason for so much suffering that's happening within the women of our society and how they feel like they can never work hard enough, or they're feeling burnt out, or they feel like they can't have trouble being consistent and working a 9 to 5 job and having the same expectations as their male counterparts and expected to work in the same way. But the truth is that it's not even possible for us to do that. And when we try, this is why we're seeing alarming rates of burnout across the globe, not just in the United States. We're seeing women who are sick with mystery types of illnesses that doctors can't figure out what's going on with them, and a lot of medical gaslighting happening, which I'm sure you've seen in your practice a lot. And so it's really kind of this missing piece of information that not only women need, but really our whole society needs to understand that there is a different biological rhythm for men and for women. And that we have to understand that biological rhythm so that we can create a society, structures, infrastructures, policies, systems across the board that fit both men and women's needs.
So actually, let's start there. What is the rhythm that we've sort of set against for men? Like, what is the rhythm that a man has that we've sort of shaped society around? And then we'll pivot back to women.
Yeah. So first, just kind of back up from there, just to understand like the historical context of how we created what we're calling the patriarchal society, which is our current kind of male focused society, male driven, even male biological rhythm driven society, which we'll talk about in a minute. But if we back way, way up to like basically the beginning of recorded history in the agricultural boom, which happened in like 1300 BC or something like that. I don't know. I'm not a historian, but we're backing up thousands of years, right? That is when industry began. That is when basically like what we're seeing for our corporate structures and our societies and our economies, everything started to build from that time period. In that time period, what happened is the men who worked the land, they became the land owners. And alongside that, they also became like the core owners and the name brand of everything in their property, which included back then their wives and their children as well. So, because the men cultivated the land, they became the land owners. And then we fast forward from there, we go into the Renaissance period where it was all about science and philosophy. And we saw all of the universities and schools popping up around the world. And this is kind of like the birthplace of modern science. And even in that time period, men were primarily the scientists. Men were primarily the ones who were allowed to go to school and be the philosophers and be researchers and things like that. So, still, it was male focused, male focused. And then we move forward from there and we hit the Industrial Revolution and the war eras, World War I and World War II. And this is when industry, as we know it, really boomed. And we had factories and all of these things. And at the same time, we started going into the war eras. And so what happened is at that time period, still it was mostly men in the workforce. But when men were called into service for war, women had to step into the workforce at that point. And that's only in the early 1900s. So we're still talking thousands of years that existed before that, where all industry, we'll call it industry, I don't know what else to call it, economy, you could say, was based on men because men were the only ones really operating within the economy. Now we see women just in the early 19th century start to make their way into the workforce and make their presence. However, all the system structures, policies, schedules, everything had already been set for the workers who were in that field, which were all men up to that point. So then you fast forward to now, and we have the age of information, we have the age of data. Everything's evidence based, everything's data driven. So here's the real big problem with that. Not only was our industry and our economy designed for the workers who were mostly in it historically, which were men, but also now that we're in the age of information, everything's data driven, everything's evidence based. Well, we have to take a look at that evidence base. What does that evidence base really look like? Even our evidence base, the majority of the data that we have available to us to make informed decisions is very skewed male, because up to 1993, women were not included in clinical research and legally banned from it by the FDA from 1977 to 1993. Even starting in 1993, women were recommended to be included in the research, but still to this day, women are not being appropriately included in the research. And the way we are researching women when we are including them in the research is not appropriate because of what you were alluding to before, which is ignoring the menstrual cycle and the hormone variations, which change our entire global physiology. So now we're here in the age of information. We rely on data, but our data is extremely male skewed. So, of course, with the information that we have, we're doing the best that we can, and we are developing systems, policies, infrastructures, economies based on the data that we have that is very male centric. So, of course, it's going to be the male perspective, and it's going to fit the male neurophysiology, and it's going to fit the male needs a lot better than it's going to fit women, because we don't have the female centric data to inform female informed policy and structures and systems and all of that. So with that, we've found ourselves in a very precarious place where now everything that we are talking about before with the mysterious illness and medical gaslighting and women not understanding their bodies and the menstrual cycles being poo-pooed as just related to reproduction and nothing else. And we have really relegated women's health as a whole to just reproductive health. And so, even when you go, whatever doctors or health professionals are listening in here, you'll understand if you reflect back to what you learned in biology class and biochemistry and any kind of health related sciences that all the figures and the structures within those textbooks, even if you look in epidemiology, public health, I went back and looked at all of mine when I had this realization, and all of those figures and models are male, except for the caveat of reproductive health. And that's where we see women kind of placed in that position, but that's basically all we get. So, with that understanding, I just want to kind of lay the foundation of how we got to the place that we got and why we're so confused and why our policies and our systems and our infrastructures are so difficult for women and don't fit our biological rhythm, which we'll talk about that next. But the male biological rhythm is a 24-hour repeating neurophysiological rhythm. It's the global physiology. So we're talking about the cardiovascular system, the respiratory system, the musculoskeletal system, the nervous system, the brain, the gut, the immune system. All of these things are set to the pace of a 24-hour repeating cycle, which is in alignment with the adrenals or the sleep wake cycle, or you call it the sun cycle if you want to be a little more esoteric, but true. So, with the male biological rhythm, it's kind of driven by those adrenals set to the pace of cortisol, melatonin, the sleep wake hormones, and it is consistent. And so, from day in and day out, men operate pretty much the exact same way from day to day. It's a repeating cycle and system, every day, consistent. There are slow changes over the course of the lifetime, just like there are with any other biological being. However, if you look from one day to the next, it's the same operation. Now, with women, it's not that way at all. It's very, very different because our biological rhythm is actually a month long, about 28 days. Each woman is a little bit different. And the reason why it's so long is because our global neurophysiology, so all those systems that we talked about before, are set to the pace of the ovarian hormones. So we still have, of course, the sleep wake cycle. We still have that circadian rhythm. We still have cortisol, melatonin, but that is not what drives our global physiological processes. Those are set to the pace of the ovarian hormones. And so what that means is as estrogen and progesterone being the main two drivers of our neurophysiology, as women, as those two hormones ebb and flow throughout the course of the month, they significantly alter all of those systems I was talking about. They change our brain function and state, our cognitive state. They change our personality, our mood, everything related to the brain and the nervous system, our stress systems. They also change the way we metabolize things, our metabolic system. They change our musculoskeletal system and capacity. They literally change everything: cardiovascular system, respiratory system. So, knowing that, we can understand that women change little by little each day and very significantly in those vastly different hormonal checkpoints. So, menstruation with estrogen and progesterone being at the lowest point. Then we go through the follicular phase, which is a rise to the peak in estrogen. So, you see that significant rise in estrogen. So, that marks those physiological changes to ovulation when we peak in estrogen. And then we also get that nice boost of luteinizing hormone, follicle stimulating hormone. So that's like a very hormonally charged place that has a significant impacts on the physiology. And then we go into the decrease in estrogen with the rise to the peak in progesterone, which also has a significant impact on modulating all of those systems. So that's why I actually say that women are actually four different women over the course of a month, because those neurophysiological changes caused by those stark contrasts in those key hormones that regulate the whole system actually change who we are. They change how we operate, they change how we feel, they change how we think, they change how we energize ourselves and fuel ourselves. All of it changes so significantly. So, going back to our research problem, our science problem, this is actually a really steep hurdle to get over. And this is the reason why women are excluded from studies. Because when you have a research subject that's not just one research subject, but many over the course of a month, you have to try to control for that. The studies, even that include women, are not controlling for the menstrual cycle, which means that the results from those studies are not accurate and may not actually be applicable. It's almost like garbage. So, unless they are actually including women controlling for the menstrual cycle and phases, actually measuring hormone levels, which costs an exuberant amount of money. I know because I study women exclusively now, and it's ridiculously expensive. So hard, very difficult because we're a moving target. So it's very hard to research. Even when you look at the research that we do as a society on animal subjects like rats and mice, we still use the male subjects because they're a lot simpler, because they're consistent, because they are a repeating system every day. So we can rely on that. The results are reliable for males. And that's the caveat. So when we create protocols like standardized health protocols, when we create systems, infrastructures, policies on male data, which is what the majority of what we have, then we are actually disempowering and ignoring and misguiding the women that those protocols are supposed to also apply to, but do not.
I feel as if everyone listening is going to go, "I knew it," or "Duh," like, "I could tell you this." Of course, obviously, we need the research and the studies behind it, but it's so frustrating because I've heard some of this before, and I'm like, "If we know this, like, why don't we account for this? Why don't we put these caveats in? Why don't we say, 'Hey, these protocols are mostly based on either male subjects or male rats,' or there were some females included, but we didn't account for her menstrual cycle, so best of luck." Instead of what we often hear is very black and white. Protocols follow the science. If it's not double blind studies, then randomized controlled double blind studies, then it's not good science. And I'm like, you just heard Dr. Kayla say it's first of all, we have to first of all, you have to include us. Second of all, you have to control for our cycle if you have one. And that's a lot of money.
A lot of money. A lot of money. Yeah. Very expensive. So, in today's day and age, everybody wants fast, cheap data. And from our governments to major corporations who are paying and funding a lot of the research that we're doing, they want their research now and they want it quickly and they want the highest standard, what you're saying. However, you can't do research quickly on women. It's not possible because even when you have to control for the menstrual cycle, you also have to collect the data every day. It can't be one data collection. You have to collect the data every day or at least through each hormonal checkpoint throughout several cycles. So now you have 100 more variables that you're dealing with in terms of you have to measure each woman's hormone cycle. You have to make sure she's in the right phase to collect the data within that phase. Now you have to go several months instead of a point in time collection, which you can do with male subjects. It makes it extremely, extremely complex. And even so, it doesn't mean that it's okay to ignore women and leave them out of the research. It's not. And we do have to do it appropriately. And right now, actually, the White House put out an initiative. I don't know if you saw back in December, 13 billion to close the gender gap in our health science research, which is like, yay. I've been praying for this and singing this from the mountaintops for many, many years. And now it's starting to get some recognition. And that's all fine and well. However, if we continue to do the same errors in our research methodology in studying women, we're not going to solve the issues. So the research has to be done appropriately for women. We have to study women over several cycles. We have to control for the menstrual cycle hormone variations. And we have to report the findings by sex. Many of the studies that include women, they don't report the findings by sex. They lump them all in together, which is mind blowing to me.
Yeah. I understand why they do it, and they're doing it wrong.
They're doing it wrong. That's just it. That's just the fact.
For sure. Well, I want to take in the research that we do know, take in the facts that we do know. I want to get into the 4 phases of the menstrual cycle to help people parse out who are these 4 women I'm turning into every month. However, I want to start with the brain because the brain is where everything kicks off. You mentioned estrogen and progesterone and the ups and downs, and it's all of that is at the direction of the brain. However, being a women's researcher, you have talked about the differences in the male and female brain. So let's even get that basics in so we understand, everyone understands those variables.
Yeah, so there are some significant differences if we're not looking at the menstrual cycle yet, which brings in a lot of other really interesting variability that we do have to understand as a society and as women. We have to understand the brain cycles of women. But even just put that aside for a moment, there are significant differences, sex differences in the brain that are, from what we understand right now, inborn. And there are also societal roles that each sex typically plays that also perpetuate some of the differences that we see in the brain function. So you can't tease those two out completely. Everyone wants to say, is it nature or nurture or whatever, that age old argument. And the answer is it's both. So what we do know is there are significant differences, that they are structural and physical differences, and they're also psychological, social differences as well. So, one of the biggest pieces is how the female and male brain is wired, you could say, or how it operates, like the electrical function of the brain. So, in the male brain, it's a larger organ overall. And with the male brain, there is less density in the neural networks of the male brain. In the female brain, it's a smaller organ in size and weight. However, it has a significantly denser neural network. And what we see as the difference with this, one of the biggest differences, is that there is stronger communication between brain hemispheres and also brain regions in the female brain versus the male brain. And it's significant and verified by many studies now. In the last 10 years, this has been a really interesting area of research that we've seen start to really blow up. So there's a lot of really cool research out there for folks who are interested to hop on PubMed and start looking up some of these keywords. So what that translates to is that the female brain, because it has like this greater connectivity between regions and between the hemispheres, it translates to a more global processing of information that happens in the female brain. In the male brain, there's actually stronger intra hemisphere connectivity, meaning within its own hemisphere or region, there's stronger connectivity within that one piece. So this translates to a lot of things, but generally, like broad strokes, is this: the female brain has more of a global processing of information, whereas the male brain has more of like a localized processing of information. It also, there's some interesting new research and theories coming out around this because it's been verified in so many studies. We're seeing that actually women are better at multitasking because of this global processing of information, because they're recruiting so many different areas of the brain for one particular task, that they actually can multitask better, whereas males are better to focus on one task at a time. There's the argument that really no humans should be multitasking because it's not really how we're wired. However, if you actually look at the societal piece or the cultural piece, you do see women forced to multitask because they might be taking care of the kids and preparing a meal while they're on a conference call, while they're doing laundry, different things. And that's more of a societal role. So it does come in, what's the chicken or the egg? Did the female brain develop after thousands of years of having to kind of multitask into this greater connectivity and denser neural network? Maybe, I don't know. But what we do know is that is the fact. And the females that are born today do have this higher density of neural network, and then also this kind of global processing piece. So that's one really interesting piece. Another really interesting piece that is really kind of a cutting edge way to think about and see the neurophysiological endocrine cascade that happens starting in the brain, the difference between male and female, is that what we're now understanding is that the male master neuroregulator is dopamine, meaning that dopamine has a regulatory effect and impact on the neurochemistry of males and also neuroendocrine cascade to balance testosterone levels. In the female system, it's different. The master neuroregulator is oxytocin, which is nicknamed the cuddle hormone, but really what it's about is connection and feeling connected. It also plays a significant role in reproductive health for women and the ability to have babies and breastfeed and all of that. So there's some interesting implications there. But what happens is with the appropriate amounts of oxytocin in the female brain, it balances the female neurochemistry and through that neuroendocrine cascade helps to balance estrogen and progesterone. It actually increases estrogen and progesterone and helps to keep that hormone cycle regulated, which, as we know, is the centerpiece of the global neurophysiology. So it's actually like this beautiful, intricate, delicate system in both males and females. But what we understand better is the male neurobiology and the male experience and perspective, which has been well documented. And so that's the one that we have society really catered to.
And when it comes to oxytocin, for everyone listening, the Root Cause Medicine podcast, we have an episode with Dr. Anna Kabeka all about oxytocin. So I encourage you to watch that. But one of the other interesting things that she was talking about when it comes to oxytocin is when women do go through perimenopause and menopause, or women who have amenorrhea. So let's say they have PCOS and they haven't cycled in a while. They're an athlete and they haven't cycled in a while. Not on the birth control pill. They just haven't had a period months. That decline in estrogen, because it's a two-way street, correct? Estradiol can stimulate oxytocin production and vice versa. And they can feel less connected, more introverted, more distance, not as excited to do things anymore. They don't feel that cuddle, don't touch me. And it can become a problem when it's oxytocin at the core.
Yes. So it is really interesting because it becomes this really great positive feedback loop because oxytocin feeds estrogen, estrogen feeds oxytocin. And it also is a little precarious because when that system is disrupted, either on the estrogen side or the oxytocin side, typically both in our modern society, it's not really set up to promote oxytocin or estrogen, really. So when that gets disrupted, it also causes a negative feedback loop. So you could either be in a positive feedback loop and it's feeding itself and it's kind of regulating itself, or you can be in the negative where it's harming itself and keeps going negative. So it is a really interesting piece that we need so much more research on to really understand all the intricate interweaving. So the other piece about the female brain that's really interesting and something that we can't ignore, which does relate to the brain cycle that aligns with the menstrual cycle, is that the female brain actually has high densities of receptors for estrogen and progesterone in certain areas that are related to emotional processing, discernment, decision making, and emotional regulation, and things like that. So that is the prefrontal cortex, the hippocampus, the hypothalamus, the insula, and the anterior cingulate gyrus. These are some areas that are significantly affected and have significantly dense receptors for these two hormones. So this is a really interesting finding that only came about in the last 10 years that really got neuroscientists scratching their heads and saying, okay, if estrogen and progesterone are actually not only ovarian hormones, but they're important neurotransmitters. What does that mean? And that's what started getting us to start looking at the menstrual cycle impact on the brain and the aha moments that we've had where we're like, okay, the female brain actually cycles along with these two hormones as they ebb and flow, and particularly in these areas that we're talking about. And so that is also what is thought to be responsible for women's heightened emotional awareness and capabilities and kind of this intuitive insight that women have, it plays into that as well. So it's not just folklore, these are real scientific neuroscience findings that we're starting to understand those underlying mechanisms now that we can measure the brain with imaging and all these other abilities to measure the brain function.
That is the absolute coolest. And I've heard you before about women's superpowers, using the term superpowers, but you've also said it very scientifically where you've talked about the neurophysiological gifts. So I suppose that's the better terminology for it. Can you touch on that before we get to the sort of 4 sections of the cycle?
Yeah, absolutely. So I would say generally, there are just these stronger capacities that women have when it comes to their cognitive function, emotional awareness, emotional processing, intuitive insight, or that kind of gut feeling or systems one way of thinking. Women also process information and learn information differently through an emotional lens. So that's why women have better episodic memory, whereas men have better working memory. So, what that means is women tie the things that they learn to experience or emotion or facial expressions, for instance. Whereas men are more linked to rote memorization, mathematical reasoning and thinking, and kind of more logical, linear processing. And women are different. They're more on the emotional scale of the way that they process information and understand.
It sounds like both sexes, male, female, have their own superpower, but it's not discussed in that way when it comes to either the education we grew up with, the way we do business, even relationships, no matter who your partner preference is, to understand these 2 different superpowers and the differences would make a world of difference for all of us.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, it has implications for relationships, as you mentioned. It has significant implications for our education system and the educational approaches that we use, which again are very male centric and catered to the way that the male brain processes information. Again, just because that's the majority of the data that we had. So that's how we set it up. But it is important to now bring in the information that we are now learning and update the way that we educate, that we teach, that we learn K through 12, but also higher education as well. Perhaps with the female perspective understood better and the female neurophysiology understood better, we would teach in more of a storytelling manner in addition to the memorization or logic or mathematical way of teaching that we typically use and see now.
I think that would be so brilliant, especially because I think a lot of women listening, obviously not all, but a lot would probably very much relate to the storytelling, right? That's usually how we communicate with each other, with our family, with our friends. It often involves a story and even just personal experience. I'm married to a man who is very logical and linear. And so he will listen. He's very empathetic. So he will listen to my story. And at the same time, I know he wishes I would boil it down to a logical linear pathway.
Yeah, and so even understanding that, when we understand our male counterparts better, we can communicate with them in a way that's effective, that they can absorb and they can relate to. And then the other way is true when males or anyone else understands the way that we process information, perhaps they could bring more emotion into the way that they're trying to communicate something, or they can bring in a story or some kind of human experience into the way that they're teaching or even just providing information or trying to communicate.
And I do think it's important to point out that the word emotion is not a negative connotation, whereas it often historically has been, right? Hysteria, hysterical, emotional, that's often what women are labeled very, very negatively. When in fact, research is showing that that aspect of it is very positive. It's how we learn, it's how we grow, it's how we connect, it's how our brain functions, and to spin that story differently as well.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. And, because we didn't understand women's heightened connection with emotions and how intricately tied that is in the way that we operate in the world and understand things and see things and show up. Because we didn't understand that, a lot of the early science that did focus on women, it focused on this particular thing. Why are women so hysterical? And there was a ton of research and resources that went into researching that specific question. And really, it wasn't a misguided question, it was a lack of understanding the underlying mechanisms. And also, when you don't understand what a woman needs and how she operates, it is upsetting. It's upsetting when your needs aren't being heard or met or understood. And especially if you don't even understand your own system and how best to support it, it is very upsetting. And we express through emotion, we understand through emotion and exchange of emotion. So it makes sense how we got here. But in awareness, it's not okay to accept the status quo anymore.
And to continue as they're doing. Exactly. Exactly. All right. Now let's tie this back to the 4 stages of the menstrual cycle since it's a two-way street. The brain is telling the ovaries what to do if you're still cycling, but it goes right back. Your estrogen, progesterone are more than just your ovaries and your uterus and reproduction because not everybody wants to reproduce, even though that's what the system, our current bodies are set up for, if you are a female. But it goes up to the brain, as you were saying, and really activates all these different areas, but only at certain parts of the cycle because your hormones aren't on like a garden hose all the time. So let's go through the 4 sections. Tell me how I'm 4 different people because I know I'm 4 different people. My husband will tell you I'm 4 different people.
Me too. My husband was very happy when I explained these 4 different people, and he was like, "Oh, thank you. Now I better understand." And so he'll be like, "Oh, is this phase 1? I can tell that your needs are changing and we can converse in a different way." So it is very helpful. So we'll start with phase 1, which is menstruation. And that, again, as we talked about earlier, is when estrogen and progesterone are both at their lowest level. So it's like the low hormone. And I also just want to preface this with each phase doesn't fit in its own perfect little box. They overlap with each other. So it can be a little bit nebulous when you're looking between each phase. And also, every woman has a different length of a cycle. And a lot of times it's not consistent. So it could be 28 days, which is the perfect model. That's actually the model that we use in research, even though very few women are regulated to a 28-day cycle. But it could be a 34-day, it can be a 26-day. There's a lot of variation. So I'm just going to talk about them in general phases in terms of the order. And then the actual days will be different for each woman. And there's a little overlap between each one. So just want to mention that. So, low hormonal phase, which is the end of the luteal, but also beginning of menstrual, beginning of the follicular phase. And during this phase, when estrogen and progesterone are at their lowest level, there's a global downshift in the female neurophysiology. The metabolism overall of women downshifts when estrogen and progesterone are at their lowest level. So there is less fuel for the body and for the brain, and there's less energy available. So that biochemical conversion of macros, so fats, carbs, and proteins, through the citric acid cycle into ATP, which fuel the cells, that whole process slows down when the hormones are at their lowest level. Then from that phase, going into phase 2, there is a change in estrogen specifically. So there's a rise to a peak in estrogen. What happens with estrogen is as it rises to a peak, it starts to rev up the metabolism. So that conversion of food into fuel that happens in the body and in the brain is heightened. There's more glucogenesis, glycolysis. There's just more bioavailable fuel in the body, which is why women's energy levels rise as they go further and further through the follicular phase.
And for everyone listening, that's like the days after your period. Like day or 2 before your period, that's the low section she meant. And then you get out of your period and you're like, "Oh, thank God, I feel so much better. I have so much more energy." That's where we're at right now.
Yes, and this is why, because you are literally getting more energy from a chemical standpoint in the body because estrogen is really helping with that whole process. So as estrogen rises to a peak, it also starts to turn up the volume on our excitatory neurotransmitters. So we're talking about epinephrine, norepinephrine, dopamine, glutamate, and serotonin, which is our mood balancing neurotransmitter. So, women, as we go through the follicular phase, so end of period through to ovulation, we typically start to feel pretty good mood wise, energy wise, focus wise. We have more mental energy, ability to focus. Interestingly, we also have more power, strength, and endurance when it comes to our muscular system as well. And it makes sense because we're getting more of that fuel for the body. So, of course, we have a higher capacity. At the same time, with the nervous system, there's a change in the nervous system capacity. So, I like to talk about the nervous system as a bucket for stress. And so, the nervous system as a bucket can handle as much stress that fills the top of the bucket. For women, our stress bucket gets bigger or smaller throughout the cycle naturally. And that's not accounting for regular life things that also make the bucket bigger or smaller. That's also true. But at a baseline, let's say all the stressors coming in from life for a particular woman are static throughout the month. So the same amount of stress each day. With that, her stress bucket is still going to get bigger or smaller. So she will have a greater capacity to handle stress at certain times in her cycle and a smaller capacity to handle stress. In that low estrogen state and in the lower estrogen states, the stress bucket is smaller. As estrogen rises to a peak, the stress bucket gets bigger, meaning that women have a higher capacity to handle stress. That's also why in the low estrogen states that women typically experience symptoms like irritability, mood swings, energy crashes, and other things that we deem to be PMS or PMS related, which isn't actually a thing. PMS is just a categorization of symptoms. It's not a thing in and of itself. This is a major piece of PMS that is misunderstood by the general population. So, in the follicular phase, so we're starting from menstrual and end of the luteal phase where the stress bucket is small. And then we're going, and the stress bucket is getting bigger and bigger and bigger as we get towards ovulation. So, again, we have more power, strength, endurance. We have more fuel for the body. We have heightened excitatory neurotransmitters. We have heightened mood stabilizing neurotransmitters. So, we're starting to feel pretty good. And then we get to the peak of feeling good, which is the ovulatory phase, phase 3, which I actually call the bloom phase because women typically feel their best during this time. Now, because of all the things that I mentioned, that peak in estrogen, here's the issue with this and the misunderstanding that happens. Women typically hold themselves to the standard or the bar of this one phase, but this phase only lasts about 3 days. So if you hit your superwoman part of the month and then you are hard on yourself when you cannot hold that standard for the rest of the month, that is crazy pants because it's not possible. We cannot hold ourselves to that standard, ladies. We have to understand that that is a juicy window that absolutely we need to be aware of and leverage, but it is not the standard, and we cannot stay there as much as we would love to.
I love that you pointed that out and said that. I hope that was a major aha for everyone listening right now.
So, from the ovulatory state, which we have all those juicy hormones, neurotransmitters, energy, power, strength, endurance, we also have a heightened emotional cognition. So, we have heightened emotional intelligence that is correlated with estrogen, which is really interesting as well. So, we hit that part. And then we start to go into the luteal phase, which is the whole back half. And this is phase 4, but it's a really long phase. It's 2 weeks. And there are different components of it. So there's like week 1 of phase 4, and there's week 2 of phase 4, and both can be very different experiences. But in general, this is the luteal phase. So the stark contrast here is estrogen has now decreased significantly. It's kind of fallen off the cliff from ovulation, and progesterone is now steadily rising to a peak into the mid luteal phase. And then it comes down the other side of the peak to the end, where we get back to that phase 1 part where it's end of luteal, beginning of menstruation. So this is also a really interesting time. So it kind of sounds like, after I mentioned all the benefits of estrogen, that it's like, oh, I just want to stay in the follicular phase, right? Because that's the juicy part. Like, I want to feel like that all the time. However, the female biology and neurology is so absolutely brilliant that it offers the different things that we need at different times. And if we can align our lifestyles and our expectations and our workflow and our schedules and our relationships and all of these things with the different phases, we will actually be much more successful and effective and healthy. But we do have to accept that there is an ebb and flow, but there are benefits of all parts. So this part, there is significant benefits as well, because progesterone, unlike estrogen, is correlated with ramping up, so revving up like estrogen did with the excitatory and mood neurotransmitters. It does that with our down regulatory master neurotransmitter, which is GABA. At the same time, progesterone also increases brain derived neurotrophic factor, which increases our neuroplasticity and neurogenesis.
You're going to put that in layman terms.
So, this is what I call the brainy phase. This is actually a really great time to learn, start new habits, to do our continuing education, to study. These are really appropriate types of activities to ramp up during this time period, because our system is getting a boost for this type of cognitive capacity. So, with GABA, what happens is we're getting that boost in GABA, which is our down regulatory neurotransmitter, which is helping our nervous system to calm down as it's getting more sensitive. Because remember, the stress bucket is getting smaller and smaller. So, progesterone comes in to try to help us out and say, okay, we're going to soothe and calm the nervous system. It's called the natural antidepressant. So, with that progesterone, it's calming and soothing the nervous system, but also what it's doing is it's enhancing our memory consolidation, which happens during sleep. And it's also enhancing the microglial activation in our brain. So, the microglial cells are the kind of janitors of the brain, and they work the night shift. And so they go around cleaning up all the junk in the brain and helping with memory consolidation and cleaning up inflammation and down regulating the nervous system as well. So, the key here is for women to focus on getting that quality sleep, especially during this phase, always, of course, but during this phase, it's extremely important to get those benefits that progesterone is trying to give you. So, if you're not prioritizing sleep during this phase, you can miss out on all of those amazing benefits. And then with the brain derived neurotrophic factor, or BDNF, which increases neuroplasticity and neurogenesis, this is what's essentially growing new neurons, new brain cells at a higher rate, replenishing those ones that are being cleaned up by the microglial cells, and at the same time, helping our brain to be more plastic or more moldable to rewire. So, this is why we can learn new habits or put new habits in place easier during this time period, because we're getting those extra boosts that progesterone provides.
Oh my gosh, I love this. And so let me take it one more step further because I know we're going to get asked. So if you have somebody listening who says, well, that's great, but I'm perimenopausal, or that's great, but I'm postmenopausal, does any of this still apply to me?
So, the answer is maybe, and we don't know. But I would say probably, and also to what extent, we don't know. So there is no research. You're not going to go on PubMed and look up postmenopausal brain phases or anything like that, because the research that's coming out now on the different brain phases, the brain cycle of women, is, of course, focused on actively cycling women. However, what we are understanding is the implications of estrogen on the brain, which is what we talked about in the follicular phase, and the implications on progesterone in the brain. So, with that, we can start to understand how some of those things might change for the female brain post menopause. But also, anecdotally, with the accounts of thousands and thousands of women, what they're reporting is even post menopause, they still feel like they have a physiological cycle. So, yes, they're not having a period and a menstrual cycle, but they have ebb and flow in energy levels. They have ebb and flow in different cognitive capacities. They have times when they sleep better and they don't sleep better. They have times when their nervous system is more sensitive and not sensitive. So, my theory on this is something that we obviously need a ton of research to really understand the underlying mechanisms and what exactly is happening, is that because the female neurophysiology is set to the ovarian hormone cycle rhythm for the vast majority of our lives, that big middle chunk, that even when the ovarian hormones kind of hand over the baton to the adrenals, we don't just then become men and physiologically become consistent like them. We are still women, our bodies still operate on this month-long cycle. So it seems that it continues on, at least in some capacity. Again, we don't know to what capacity that is and the underlying mechanisms of action, even though we could have theories on why that is. But it is really interesting, and it is something that we have to acknowledge, because menopause is here, whether we like it or not. It's happening. It's in the workplaces, it's in our governments, it's at home, it's in our families, it's everywhere where women are. And so we do need to start asking these questions and taking a deeper look so that we can better understand the women in our lives, and we can better support them, and we can better help them to go through that hormonal shift and understand how their biorhythm might stay the same and might also change.
And one quick clarification I want to make, the four phases, the effect of the brain, the hormones, and everything, does or doesn't apply if she is on a birth control pill.
So that's another question mark. And it also depends on what type of hormone replacement therapy. So, hormonal birth control is hormone replacement therapy, even though we're not told that that's the case. So, that's another issue when your daughter is going in to the OBGYN and they recommend birth control. Understand that that is exogenous hormones, it is hormone replacement therapy, but a different form of it. So, women don't even really understand that that's what they're being given. I know that when I got on the pill at 17, I didn't know what it was. I just knew that it would prevent pregnancy. Outside of that, I didn't understand that it was hormones and it was shifting my neurophysiology and all of that. So, absolutely, it does, because, of course, estrogen and progesterone are important neurotransmitters, important neuroendocrine regulators, and they regulate all of those global physiological systems that we talked about. So when you start to alter that, you will alter the female biological rhythm. So it's a question of what type of hormones are they on? Are they on the consistent one? Are they on one that ebbs and flows with their cycle and kind of regulates them to a 28-day cycle? Because if so, then it may be the same biological rhythm depending on when they're getting estrogen, when they're getting progesterone, and how long have they been on those therapies. Because the longer that they are altering that chemistry, the more significant the physiological impact will be. So, what I can say from my own personal experience and many of the patients that I've worked with is, once they have gotten off of the birth control pill, the hormone birth control pill, or whatever type of other, if it's the shot or any other type implant, whatever it might be. So, once they get off of that, it takes a while for their body to regulate, and it typically, that time period that it takes for their body to regulate back to a baseline menstrual cycle and ovarian cycle is typically correlated with how long they've been on it. And so for me, I was on it for like 13 years. And then when I came off, it took me 3 or 4 years to regulate back to a normal cycle. Once I did, and at the same time, I was learning all of the things that I know now about the female biological rhythm. I was able to confirm that my biorhythm is in alignment with my menstrual cycle. So it seems to regulate back to the natural state, which is to have that biological rhythm connected with the natural ovarian hormone cycle.
Okay. And then last question, being a researcher, what do you see on the horizon for female research? What do you either actually see or hope to see and are trying to be a part of?
Yeah. Well, the first thing that is front of mind is, of course, this $13 billion that the White House initiative has promised to closing the gender gap in health science research, which means that there's going to be a lot of grant funding for women's health research. So I know that that's going to happen. What I hope is that the right policy reform happens before that in terms of the way we do research with women. And that's related to everything we were talking about before. So my hope is that that happens. And I am as involved as I can be in getting more involved in those political processes and in the research reform and the policies around that. So we do want to make sure that that research is done appropriately so we don't waste $13 billion. So that is front of mind, and that's going to happen over the next 5 years. That initiative is rolling out. And in addition to that, there's so much really fascinating research that's coming out around perimenopausal and postmenopausal women who are now starting to get some focus and attention, and especially around the female hormone cycle, these hormones in relation to the female brain and those sex differences in our brain, in our nervous system, and in our biological processes at large. So because women have gotten so little attention, so little funding in research, it's the wild, wild west. I mean, the options are endless. It's super, super exciting to be in this field at this time because we have nowhere to go but up from here.
I love that. Oh my gosh, Dr. Kayla, I love having you on. This is so fascinating. And I hope everyone has just thoroughly appreciated all the knowledge you have brought to the table. Where can everyone find you?
Yeah, thank you so much for having me again. If anyone's interested to learn more about the female biological rhythm or anything that we talked about today, you can check out my website at herbiorhythm.com. And then you can also find me, Dr. Kayla Osterhoff, on the socials, on Instagram, Facebook, wherever else. And then also, if you want to search my name in your podcast search engine, you'll find lots of other really cool podcasts that you can binge on after finishing this one.
Amazing. Again, thank you so much for coming on, my friend. I so appreciate you.
Thank you.
Welcome to Rupa Health, the best place to order, manage, and track results from over 30 different lab companies in one single place for free. It's going to take you under 2 minutes to sign up, and you can order any functional medicine lab for your client in under 30 seconds. Let me show you how it's done. So here's our beautiful interface. I'm typing in the name of my client, selecting the lab that I want to order for them, and hitting send. From there, Rupa and their amazing team handle the rest. They email the client, collect payment, and even offer an interest-free 3-month payment plan. We've also built the world's largest library of information about chronic health conditions, the lab tests that can help you find the root cause, and the evidence-based interventions that you can use to help people heal from them. It's called the Rupa Health Magazine. There, we have in-depth articles about almost any health condition you can imagine. And we give you step-by-step protocols that other clinicians have used to help their clients heal and that are verified by evidence-based sources. You should totally check it out, and it'll transform your practice. And we can't wait to see you. So make sure you sign up today at rupahealth.com.